Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Opinion Machine, the show where we talk about all things gaming. My name is Killjoy, and today we're going to be talking about what I think makes a good RTS. Now, this stems from the recent release of June the Spice Wars, which is a RTS/4X game. And, you know, I'm kind of in the middle of playing it, kind of getting my bearings for it, but it did make me think about how RTS has kind of become this genre that seems to always want to have RTS something. Like, over the years, other people have tried to simplify it, or you had a whole genre of MOBAs basically evolve from it, and all these other things, and it always feels like RTS just kind of get, like, there's always stuff trying to be rammed in with it. Like, this June Spice Wars game, it's kind of fun, but it feels less of an RTS and more of a 4X game with just sort of real-time elements. And so that got me thinking. I was like, okay, so what makes a good RTS, and what would I do if I was making an RTS? What's the things that I enjoy about RTS, basically? And so we're going to go through that today. Now, the main examples we'll be pulling from will be the Command & Conquer series, StarCraft, Warcraft, Age of Empires, primarily, because those are the games that most people know, like the big hitters of RTS. Now, I've always said, since last year, I don't really want to talk about Blizzard or Activision games, but it's kind of hard not to talk about StarCraft, at least in this, and so understand that it's more just a means of an end to try and explain stuff. You know, not endorsing all the stuff that's gone on over there. So let's go through the things that I think are important about an RTS. Now, most games that come out now have a single player and a multiplayer component, and you know, that's kind of what you expect from an RTS in these days, is that you have your single player, which kind of, for the most part, teaches you how to play the game, usually introduces elements as you go forward, and then the multiplayer is where a lot of the hardcore kind of people that stick around and play and like figure out strategies and all that sort of stuff. So I guess the first thing when designing an RTS is, do you make it primarily single player or multiplayer? And so that's the first thing. Is it single player focused? Single player focused or multiplayer focused? And by the way, I am dyslexic, so you're going to see a lot of spelling mistakes. The reason I'm using this here is so you can visibly see what I'm talking about at the time and like my ideas and things. Now, I primarily play RTS single player. I do play some multiplayer stuff, but I kind of like RTS games to just for the story. Like, when I was growing up, I used to play a lot of it on easy mode. I just kind of like building up a base and then running across the map and blowing up the enemy's base. And Command & Conquer games, they've always had like fairly simple but fun campaigns. StarCraft 2 has very, very good campaigns. Age of Empires isn't really for me, but I can see why people get invested into those. They're quite slow paced, but there's a lot of campaigns, there's a lot of levels to do, and those games do allow for that. There are other RTS games that have good single players. I mean, Total Annihilation, Supreme Commander, stuff like that. But yeah, the first decision is, do you make it single player or multiplayer focused? I think the mistake that some companies make is they try to go for the esports aspect, and that's kind of where they fall flat. They should really focus on just, is the core gameplay like fun? Because skirmish mode versus the AI, like AI romping, like or AI stomp, whatever it's called, is something that happens a lot. A lot of people just like to play a casual game, then playing the game versus the AI on easy, or just playing like team matches, stuff like that. So I would say if I was making an RTS, I'd probably focus more on single player / co-op content, because that's a good way of trying to teach people by doing co-op stuff, and focus primarily on that rather than the multiplayer side of it. And hopefully that if the game's core mechanics are good enough, the multiplayer side, if you are looking for an esports side of that, will eventually bloom. Two games that I think Red Alert 3 is like, no matter, I know it wasn't necessarily the most well received Command & Conquer game, but Red Alert 3 has a really good setup for co-op. The whole game is designed around co-op, but if you play single player, you get an AI partner. All kind of works. The maps, you know, you have your two bases and you have big maps, and you're fighting against whatever the enemy is, or you play it with somebody else and you get to play the whole story with somebody. I think that's really cool. That's one way of doing it. We see StarCraft 2 do it a different way, with the fact that you have your single player campaigns, and then the co-op mode is you guys get to pick different leaders essentially, and you play those factions, and they have different abilities. They don't tend to play exactly like your typical multiplayer match, and you get to use units that aren't in the multiplayer. You know, you get to do some fun things. It's a fun mode. It's just a little bit limited by the fact that it's stopped being supported now, but there are plenty of missions, there's plenty of upgrades, there's plenty of people to play as, and it's a good mode. So yeah, that's the first thing you make. I think for me, I very much enjoy the single player side of it, because I think with the multiplayer side, the esports side of doing RTS, it is hard. It is hard when you have command groups and you have your building set up and you're building different units and all that, but I think single player slash co-op, I should probably put that single player, put in brackets there, co-op. I think that's absolutely the way to go. I think that's how you get people invested. People like single player or like co-op experiences a lot in this day and age, and I think that's one of the biggest things that you should be doing. Alright, so when we come to the game itself, so you know, when we come to the core gameplay, one of the biggest things that, well, there's two big things really, isn't there, with RTS, is how do you know, produce and control units, and the other one is usually income and economy. So you have your economy side of like RTS, and then you have your you know, your micro and macro essentially, which is how you build stuff and how you can move individual units while playing. So let's talk about the economy, because I think the economy is one of the most interesting and important parts of RTS, and you see this quite different from different types of games. So economy, I cannot spell. Tell you what, resource management, we'll go with that. So resource management, how is this dealt with? So we've got what we call what I have dubbed the harvester style, and the harvester style is basically the C&C style of resource management. So what I mean by that, in Command & Conquer games, you build a refinery. I should also put, probably, just so people know, this is also used for the June style as well. You build a harvester, the harvester automatically goes out to find either ore or tiberium or spice in the case of June, sucks up X amount of money, whether it's like 500 or something or 1,000. Once it's full, comes back and dumps it off, goes back again. It's very automated. But it allows you can control your harvester where you want it to go, but generally speaking, you just want you want to get as many harvesters out so they're going back and forth as efficiently as possible, collecting their minerals and then dumping it, and you get a lump sum amount. And this is one way of doing it. This is probably my favourite way of doing it, but it's not necessarily the most popular way of doing it. And in Red Alert 3 they kind of reduced this to the point where you basically just plonk the refineries in front of these ore things and they go back and forth. It's much more efficient, basically. Excuse me. And yeah, so that's the idea, is that you have harvesters, and what this does is it allows the enemy to go in, like, if you want, you can like try and take out the harvesters because it takes time to build them. If you destroy harvesters, it massively reduces that person's income, and it makes it very hard for them to, you know, go and get more money, because you need X. So it's about what? Let's say it's roughly about 1,000 credits to buy a harvester. If you can't afford one and you don't have one, you need to sell buildings. So it's it's one of those things in most games when it has any form of worker that you need to massively. If you disrupt that by destroying harvesters, it really slows down the enemy. So that's always one way of doing it. You can take out the enemy's harvesters. You can hang around in the ore fields and deal with the harvesters, and then that will just massively stump the opponent, and then they will either have to sell stuff or just use what they've got to win. One other style which I've dubbed the worker style. This is pretty common. This is in both StarCraft and in Age of Empires. If I spell that right. It's probably used in other games, but this is the style where you have multiple workers gathering resources. Now the biggest difference between this style and the harvester style is a harvester goes out, collects a massive lump sum, dumps that lump sum, goes out again. So you're looking maybe like 1,000 credits. With the worker style, what you tend to have is they are quicker, and they come back with less resources, but they go back out quicker. So like, for example, in StarCraft, your base starts right next to a mineral patch. The workers go back and forth fairly quickly. I think they bring back like 10 minerals every time. In Age of Empires, you know, you can send your dudes to go into a bush, harvest the berries, they take the berries back to the storage silo, and you can kind of make it more efficient by building buildings very close. So if you build a building right next to the berries in Age of Empires, you can have about 6 people working, and it will go up fairly quickly because they don't have to walk very far. Same with StarCraft. If you have to long distance mine, is what they call it, that's not very efficient. So you build a base next to a mineral patch, and you send the workers out, and you have an efficient amount of workers. So if there's in StarCraft, I think it's about 16. That works out with eventually what you'll get is the workers mining, going back to base and switching with the other miners fairly efficiently. Now we see this style is quite popular because what it allows you to do is you can focus a bit more on the resources by going, you know what, I want to spend the resources on more workers more quickly, but that is a detriment to your army. So you have to kind of play this balancing game of being like, okay, I've built 10 workers, but I've only got maybe a couple of soldiers to defend myself with. Now you have to hope that the other person doesn't see you do this and then go, oh, you know, and then rush for more army units and come across and defeat you. So it's a balancing act all the time between getting workers and getting army units, because ideally you want as many bases and as many workers as possible to have that income rolling in consistently, so you can have the bigger army. You can constantly be upgrading and building things. So there's that, and StarCraft and Age of Empires work on this system. If you get too many workers and not enough army, then you get behind because they attack you and you can't defend yourself. But it can also happen the other way, where you can get a big army, go over, get defeated, and now you realise that the enemy has double the amount of workers, and they can significantly more efficiently get resources. So that's the other one of the other styles. The last style I'm going to call plus minus. Now this is a weird one. It will make sense when I explain. This is what Total Annihilation and what was the other game that uses this? So the Total Annihilation style, the Supreme Commander style. Let's put Supreme there, because that's basically, if I could spell, that's basically a spiritual successor. Now, what I mean by the plus minus system, now this is where you have a resource, and the more of that resource you have, you'll have a plus sign, and you're getting like plus 20 every second, or whatever the time frame is of it. And if you have minus, you're losing that amount. Now, the way that Total Annihilation did it was, say you have metal and energy. If you've got an income of plus 100 energy, but then you've got an outgoing of minus 50 energy, that means you've got plus 50 energy coming in all the time. And so what this allowed people to do is you can have like almost like a stockpile to a degree, and as long as that it's in the plus, you can keep building things like loads of stuff at once to as long as the deficit isn't gone into the red. And so that meant, so if you have an excess amount of energy, you're like, right, I'm going to build defenses, I'm going to build units, I'm going to build buildings, and my energy bar is still in the positive, so that's not going to affect it. However, if you do this and it goes into the red, and it goes into the red significantly, and you start getting minuses on it, what this does is significantly slow down your buildings. So in Total Annihilation, if you build a ton of stuff and it starts going down and it's constantly down and you gain more and it goes down again, it slows down your building construction and unit construction massively. It basically like reduces it by about 75%. It's quite the what's the word? Devastating, honestly. But this is an interesting style. This is the style that also a more recent game. This is what Dune Spice Wars basically uses. This is what Northgard uses, so the guys at Shiro Games. And it's not a bad system, but it is it's probably not the most popular system of doing resource management. It is interesting because it does allow you to, as long as you've got more than you need, you can build tons of stuff, as long as it doesn't go into the red, essentially. And it is a cool way of doing it, but this is also my least favourite way of doing it, just because it doesn't, you can get screwed over if you're not careful. This is again a balancing act in a very different way. You have to be very aware of like what you've got coming in, what you're building all the time. And all these systems here for resource management, these are all valid reasons, and they all work in their own right. I am a big fan of the harvester style. I like it because it's just kind of like you build your harvesters, they go off and do their own thing. Hopefully they're protected. You can just kind of forget about it. But that's also limited in the fact that if you do lose those harvesters, you're very quickly going to run out of money. The worker style works really well as well, because essentially if a couple of workers die, yes, it will slow you down, but you still have other workers. I feel like harvester style is much more devastating if you lose a harvester, and you'll find in those games that harvesters are usually heavily armored, so they do take a hell of a lot of punishment before they get blown up. For that reason, because essentially you can just run over and kill them. If you keep killing them, you will massively cripple an opponent, whereas if you destroy 4 or 5 harvesters of an opponent, sorry, 4 or 5 workers of an opponent, yes, you will be behind because your economy slowed down, but you can still build and gain other workers and stuff. It's not the end of the world. If you destroy somebody and they lose like 10 workers, that's a massive blow. So it's kind of like that. And the plus minus system is essentially once you destroy the enemy's buildings that are gaining them whatever those resources are, they are at a huge deficit, and their buildings will not build. They will not be able to build units. It's like I said, they all have their positives and minus essentially. So yeah, resource management. Me personally, I like the harvester style. I think that's, if I was building an RTS, that's what I would go with. Maybe a mix of harvester and worker style, but like I like the fact that it's not overly focused on you micromanaging your workers, which is obviously popular for people, but I like to focus mostly on units, building units, upgrading units, and like the army side of it. Just so just so you guys are aware, like the command and conquer style of RTS is definitely my preferred style, because it does focus on combat and unit movement, and less about the money and stuff like that. Kind of like it's quite simple, I guess, for what it's going for, but I like that style. On the other side of this, so we've got the resource management side of it. We also have the units. Now, this is something that there's many things we can look at when it comes to units. I'm going to put unit / buildings because these things kind of go in hand, or base buildings probably better. What do I mean by this? So this is the idea of like what do you build, and what units come out of it, and all that kind of good stuff. So the actual other part of so you have the economy, and then you've got like, I guess, the strategy side of it, which is building the right buildings at the right time, getting the right units. Now this is a whole kettle of fish on the way that you kind of want to, how every RTS does this. Some games, StarCraft and Age of Empires go very much into the kind of like rock paper scissors idea, that you have units that are very good at one thing. Age of Empires more so. Like Age of Empires, if you've got siege units do significant damage against buildings, but then you need other units to protect those siege units because they're crap against everything else. So if you've got catapults or trebuchets, they're not going to be able to hit cavalry because they're probably moving too quick. Cavalry are really good against that, which means you then need anti-cavalry to protect your siege units, and the whole strategy comes in having the right composition of units. StarCraft 2, you can kind of win with one combination, but you will be kind of shooting yourself in the foot doing that. So if you're playing as Terran and you've only got Marines, yes, you've got a silly amount of firepower, and you can whittle down certain things quickly, but if you go up against heavily armoured units, you're going to be at a massive deficit because they don't stack so well against heavily armoured units. Or if you go against something that's splash damage, they will die very quickly. So there is the idea of unit composition specifically with that. And there's also the side of it, which is the base building side of it, of like, how do you, when it comes to base building, are you having one building to create multiple units, one building for one unit? Do you need other attachments to those buildings? Do you have, even the UI side of it, do you have the Command and Conquer style, which is everything's down the side, you click on the tank tab, you click on like you want to build 10 tanks, and you set a rally point, and then you focus on the army? Or do you want the other style, the Age of Empires StarCraft style, and even the Total Annihilation style, which is you click on the building, you build what you want, and you always have to go to that building to build units. There's no sidebar, there's no clicking on a picture to build stuff. It's you click on that building, whether it's on a hotkey or not, but you click on that building and you say, I want to build 4 Marines, I want to build 4 soldiers or whatever, and you can queue them up. but you have to go to that building to do it. And that's an interesting one, because again, I definitely skew towards having the sidebar. So my favorite RTS of all time is Emperor Battle for June, which is very much a Westwood RTS, which is, you know, the same guys that do Command and Conquer. So I like the fact that I've always got access to every unit down the side of my screen. It means I can focus on what I'm currently doing. I can open up the infantry tab and I go, alright, I need some anti-infantry, so I'm going to build some snipers. And I need some, I don't know, I need some anti-air, so I'm going to build some tanks that can shoot up, or in this case Mongoose if you're Atreides, for example. So I'm like, I need that and that and that, and I don't ever have to go back to the base to deal with it. I can just pick those things, wait for them to build, and then whatever I'm currently doing on the battlefield with the current army I've got, I can focus on that. Which I like. I like that because it lets you focus on the micro side and kind of like dealing with what's going on at the moment. Whereas with StarCraft and Age of Empires, you can hotkey up the buildings, you can set a rally point, so you hit, like, let's say 1, you've got all your barracks set to 1, or you've got all your, I don't know, like archery ranges in Age of Empires set to 2. You can click that, and then you can click the shortcut keys on the keyboard, whatever you've set them to, or the defaults, and that will build. So it's not like both, there's not necessarily one that's inherently worse than the other. It's just the good thing about the side tab is that it's always there. You rather than clicking on a building and then having to maybe potentially remember all the shortcuts, you have the side tab, you can see little pictures of everything, and you go, right, I want 10 of those, and you can hit like shift click and it'll twice, and that'll start producing 10. They're both, I think they both work really well. But I like the side tab there because you can switch between buildings, units, the air, sea, land, all the different stuff. They're all in their own little tabs. It's very visible, and yeah, you don't have to go back and manually click. Especially if you're new to a game, you will go back and manually click on it and choose what you want. So that's that side of it. I think there's room to kind of have a hybrid there. I think the idea, like, you know, potentially having... could you do a hybrid of it? I guess you could have the buildings on the tab, but then you'd have the units in the barracks or factories or whatever. Definitely something I'm interested in seeing, because I think there's for me, if you took a lot of the elements of Command and Conquer and StarCraft and merged them together, that's what my perfect RTS would be. But yeah, so I'm not really writing much here, am I? So there's the side tab, way of building, and all the clicking on the building. So yeah, those are the two main ways I've noticed it. There are probably other ones that are in between this, but I'm kind of going off ones that are mostly used. For me personally, again, I prefer the side tab way. It lets you have access and see everything. On top of that, do you have, like, what do you have? How do your tech trees work essentially? So Command and Conquer is, if you build a barracks, you get access to, I think it's a gunner, grenadier, rocket launcher dude. Those are like basic, and they're the same across both teams usually. If you take the original Red Alert, which both the Soviets and the Allies were basically the same in some aspects. I think the Soviets had machine gunners, grenadiers, and that was it, I think. Whereas the Allies, I think, had machine gunners, rocket launchers, and medics. So there is some difference, but it's okay to have that crossover. Like, having just basic infantry being like your gunner stuff is fine. And then as you would build the barracks, and then you build other buildings like a tech center, you would unlock more units in the barracks that you couldn't actually access until then. So like, you get Tanya, or you'd get like a, I don't know, if you're the Soviets, you get a flamethrower trooper or a shock trooper. So it was kind of, that's one way of doing it. StarCraft 2, it's kind of the same. They do it in the fact that, like, each of the races in that game, you can build like a building. So in the case of like the Protoss, you have the gateway. The gateway acts as your basic unit building, and to get access to the other units, you need a specific building. So you're like, oh, I want to build. Actually, I'll use Terran because that's probably easier to understand. You build a barracks to build infantry units. And so you build your marine, but to get access to the other units within it, there's an add-on called the Tech Lab. You stick that on, and that gives you access to the other units. And then there's one last unit, the Ghost, which is a sniper unit, which you can't get access to until you build another building on top of that. And the reason for that is because it's the abilities it has is significantly more powerful. So that's kind of like how tech trees work. It's usually a case of you can build your barracks, your factory, your basic unit building units, but to gain specific units, you usually have to build of other buildings off of that, and that's the same with most like Warcraft, Starcraft, Command and Conquer, Age of Empires. Pretty much every RTS does this. That's how you kind of negate giving players access to too many units early on and too many units that are too powerful. And that's kind of like the smart way of doing it. Like if you're playing Red Alert 3, you have 3 different teams. You have the Allies, Soviets, and the Japanese. And when you build your buildings, you'll see everything that's grayed out, and it tells you what you need to get access to it. They all get access to their units in different ways. But like if you want Tesla-related things, you build a power plant or an advanced power plant as the Soviets. If you're the Japanese, you unlock, you build the building and you get like special upgrades for those buildings. You research that thing, boom, here you go, there's access to this. And every game does it differently, but there's basically ways that they negate getting units too early. And I think this is just something that you see across the board with all RTS pretty much, where it's like, here are your buildings that are used for building, here are the ones for upgrades, here's the ones that kind of you just need to allow you to get other units. And they're all done slightly differently. But yeah, so that's what we're mainly looking at with these games, is you have like the units, like how you get access to them, how easy is it for you to build them, and then the base building and like how that affects what you can get and what you can build. It does bring me on to something else, which is upgrades versus I can't remember how to spell this, so let's see what I mean. So veterinary, that's not how you spell it, is it? Let's put level ups. So what I mean by this is when you get veterinary, whatever the word is, on units. Now you see this a lot in Command and Conquer, and basically this is where a unit, once it's killed so many units, gets a little arrow above its head, and then it gets a second one, and then gets a third one, and that is the idea that those units are getting stronger in time. And when you get a level 3 unit in Command and Conquer, especially Red Alert 3, they usually do insane amount of damage, their attack speed is much quicker, they might have higher armor, a lot of the time they regenerate health. Basically getting a unit and keeping it alive to that level is significant. Now if you have a big army of level 3 units, you have a very destructive army. It's not to say they can't be beat, it's just they just hit significantly harder. And it's kind of one of the things that makes that one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is the upgrades way, which I think, again, you see in a lot of games, where you have, in StarCraft and in Age of Empires, you have basic upgrades, which are like increase the attack power of all of the infantry, or increase the attack power or the defense of all the horseback units. And that's basically the more common way of doing it, because what that does is it locks off. You get a choice in that sense. So if you're building a bunch of cavalry, and you're like, right, I want these guys to, the enemy's got a lot like archers or something, you're like, I want them to get up close and want them to take less damage, you can go and build the defense upgrade, so they reduce the damage they take by 1, or however much that armor works. And so when you run into battle, the cavalry get shot, they get closer up, and they manage to kill off all the archers because they had that upgrade, they just lasted a bit longer. Versus the attack upgrade, which is, they probably would kill the archers off quicker if they got there, but they might die because they didn't survive as much damage. So there's always a balancing act with like upgrades. You're like, well, okay, maybe I do want to be able to hit harder, and that might be great when you're being the defender. If you're the defender, going for attack upgrades is great, because generally speaking, if you've got, especially in Age of Empires, people in towers or your armies near your base, when somebody rolls up, you're probably going to get the first shot off, so probably doing damage, probably the smart thing. If you're the aggressor and you know what the enemy's got, and you're like, well, I don't want to just run my units in, then maybe getting defensive. That's just an example. That might not be the best way of doing it. That's just an example of saying there's some strategy, there is choice. On top of that, a lot of these games have specific upgrades. Like you get a lot of upgrades in Age of Empires for workers, you know, 20% increased speed of gathering resources, things like that. StarCraft does it where you have your, attack and defense upgrades, but most units in that game will have a specific upgrade. For example, there is the Marine. The Marine has the ability called Stim Pack. That is a active upgrade. When you use it, your unit takes damage, but it's like fire rate is increased by and movement speed are increased by 20%, something along those lines. I can't remember the exact numbers. You also get passive upgrades, like the Marine again. You get a combat shield, which increases its health. So that is the most common way of doing it as well. You do, like I said, you do see veterinary levels in other things, but you don't tend to see both. I can't think of a game that has both off the top of my head. There probably is one, but I'm blanking on it. Playing Emperor Battle for June, for example, you can, as the Atreides, when you level up your units, when you level up your infantry, when you get a level 3 one, you can shove it back in the barracks, and now you can train all that particular unit at level 1. So they already start off with increased either range, power, whatever it is. So there are, again, like pluses and minuses to both. Like, it's an interesting way of doing it. I think the upgrade way is better, because you can kind of pick and choose when you want them. I mean, at the end of the day, you want every upgrade in the game, like realistically, because every upgrade is going to give you some kind of buff. They might not always be on the same level, like saying giving a unit the ability to have a bigger vision radius is probably better than something having, like, I don't know, +1 range. I mean, to be fair, it depends on the unit, I guess, but like, if generally speaking, anything that's got a buff then and there, it's going to really massively help out in one specific area, you might value that as more than range or something. Like, normally I think attack speed and range are the things considered to be the best type of upgrades, because you can output more damage and you can fire further. But there might be stuff that's like makes your this particular unit invisible when it's standing still, which might be really, really good for that particular unit, that playstyle, stuff like that. So there's all kinds of things. That's the cool thing about the upgrade system with that. But yeah, so we've covered a few things with this already, but something that is really important is obviously graphics. Now, I will find a picture of to give some examples of this, but essentially, when you have RTS games, what do you think of? Let's find some pictures to show this off. Right, it's all about the art style with these games, right? Because you're not gonna, if you're going to play an RTS, you want it to be fairly clean. You want maybe a clean art style, but you also want to be able to see what you're doing and be it memorable. And so let's just grab this image. Right. So where have we gone? All right. So here's an image of StarCraft 2. All right. What makes this actually like memorable and clean is the fact that it has a very stylized look. It's very cartoony, believe it or not, but it's not cartoony to the point where it's like super cartoony. It's just very stylized. It's an art style. It's very easy to see. This is a command center. Above it says workers. Here are your workers. Here's your buildings. The UI at the bottom there. Very clean look, but it's very memorable in the sense that it doesn't look boring. It's got lots of color, but it's a very artistic choice. Now, if we compare that to something that I think has a very forgettable art style, bear with me. No, that's a tiny image. I need a bigger image than that. That'll do. Alright. So this is Age of Empires 4. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad looking game, right? But this is not a game that's going to stick in my memory. This game is gone for a very realistic look, and I don't think that's the correct choice with RTS. Look, all these units look the same, right? Even the enemy units here look the same, right? Now, this isn't a slander on the gameplay or the game, right? I don't like Age of Empires, but I completely appreciate that a lot of people love this stuff, right? But this game Like, which one are you going to remember? Are you going to remember StarCraft, or are you going to remember Age of Empires 4 in years to come? Especially unit design. If I showed you a picture of a battlecruiser from StarCraft 2 versus a generic cavalry dude, like, you're going to remember the battlecruiser just because it sort of sticks out. Like, a guy on horseback isn't that memorable. Now, I know that this is meant to be more realistic, but the art style really does matter, right? Like, I've played a couple of the factions, and even in the older Age of Empire games, like, I couldn't tell you. They don't stick out to me. I will say Age of Empires 2 and 1 has because of the time that they came out, have a more stylized art style, which I think is more memorable, and I think actually do look better. Maybe that's partly the isometric view as well. But Age of Empires 4 is a beautiful looking game, but it's not a memorable art style, and I think the art style really makes it. We'll look at one last game for this. Let me just find it. And this goes for unit design as well, right? So you've got to think about unit design. Like, what do people remember when it comes to these games? You know, it's hugely important to have things that stick out. And that's the thing. It's like, I can remember units from Command & Conquer, and I can remember units from StarCraft, and even Total Annihilation to some degree, because I remember what they were very unique at the time. Right, here we go. Oops. Spelt that wrong, but hopefully you should have. So on this picture, you should be saying this is a mammoth tank. Here's the difference. Here's the Soviet units, very red, and here is the Empire of the Sun, which is like the Japanese team, and they have like high-tech looking stuff. And here's a massive, like this game is very stylized. Again, here's like a flying suit, and this art style. Again, maybe this game's aging a little bit, but I like playing this game. It's very colourful. Things have an kind of cartoony artistic choice art style, but I like that. And that each team feels very different. Each team is a very different colour. You can very easily distinguish what a unit is. Like, I know that this thing here, where is it? This thing here, this is a hammer tank that the Soviets have. This is a tsunami tank like the Japanese have in the game. Whereas in Age of Empires, if you've got a guy on horseback on both teams, yes, they might look a little bit different depending on which, if you're playing the English or like one of the other teams in the game. But at the end of the day, it's just a guy on a horseback. At least with these, they have a significant look to them, and I think that's what really matters when it comes to graphic. It's very much like art style is really important, and also unit design. I think these really makes it very easy for people playing these games to be like, I can tell quickly looking at something, that is a tank from this team, that is a unit from this team, that is an enemy worker. Hugely important. So graphics, while they don't need to be ultra realistic, they do need to be somewhat, I find, somewhat stylized and have strong unit design, you know, because that's what makes it so fun. Like, if I'm playing StarCraft 2 and I build a siege tank, and you know, in that game the tanks like get extra legs and the gun switches over to this massive cannon, that's memorable because it's like this fun tank that turns into this big old turret. The carrier, which is this huge capital ship firing out little things. Like, I remember all this stuff. Same with Red Alert. Like, the Soviets have a massive blimp with a big shark face on it that goes around bombing things. Like, you know, you've got a unit that fires people out of a cannon. There is a stupidity to it to some degree, but that's what makes it memorable. And they're done in a style that's always going to look good in years to come. Red Alert 3 doesn't look that bad for its age, and it came out like early, you know, I don't even know, 2010, maybe slightly later than that. So, you know, that's something else that's really, really important to me. What else have we got on here? I guess with units as well, something else that comes to RTS is the idea of unit roles. And this is the idea that what kind of game are you going for, in the sense of, are you going for a Command & Conquer style, which is, you've got a guy with a machine gun, which makes him good against infantry, and that's it. So any type of infantry he's going to be fairly good at. You've got a guy with a rocket launcher, which makes him anti-tank. And that's kind of it. Command & Conquer is very much a case of things are either good against vehicles, or they're good against infantry, or, you know, or anti-air. StarCraft, Age of Empires is a lot more of that, like I said before, the rock, paper, scissors kind of idea, where you have a unit, it's good against one thing generally, or it has one particular role, and so you have a group of units that can kind of do that. In StarCraft 2 you have your Marine, you have your Marauder. Your Marines are your damage per second, they're the ones that put out a silly amount of damage. Your Marauders are there to tank and take a lot more damage, but also very good against something that is armoured. So if you're fighting an army and you have these guys and they can do more damage to armoured units, you can chunk off quite a lot of damage off those units, as well as also having this line of Marines firing at a significantly faster pace. So that's kind of like the idea. Age of Empires, like I said, takes it way more, you know, siege units are good against buildings, all that sort of stuff. It's very much a thing that you need to keep in mind when designing a game. Like how much do you want to lean into the rock, paper, scissors aspect of it? I prefer it when it's not completely that way. I like how StarCraft does it. For the most part, you can kind of build a certain type of units and you're alright, but Age of Empires goes too far for me, where it really does rely on having a mixture of units that are good against different things, because that's just the way the game's intended. So that's you know, a massive part of when playing these games. That can make or break some RTSs for me, where it's like if I've got units and they're doing no damage to something, I'm like, okay, this is the type of game it is. Kind of turns me off a bit. Don't really want to play that. I don't mind having some element of that, where it's like I'm in an unfavourable matchup, but I can still win potentially. And then other things that I guess with RTS that need to be focused on when they're being built is how fast is your game? So game speed. Like, this is a huge one, right? Command & Conquer, again, I would come back to this, Emperor Battle for June. You set those games on normal. What normal speed is, that's actually a nice speed for me. StarCraft 2 is quite fast, Age of Empires is quite slow, and that's just the way that those games are designed. Every RTS is kind of designed for a different speed. StarCraft 2 is a very, very, very fast RTS game. It's all about very quick decisions, you know, micro, things like that. Age of Empires does have that, but it is a significantly slower style of game. Supreme Commander, Total Annihilation are very slow games. It's not to say you can't rush in those games, you can, but they take, you know, the whole idea of those games are these massive grand battles. And then yeah, Command & Conquer is kind of somewhere between all of them, where it's like kind of not quite as quick as StarCraft 2, but there's also less to think about. You can kind of just stockpile your units and you can go. So there's obviously that's one thing you have to think about. And I think mostly, like, the one last thing that I think we're seeing, you know, you should see is abilities of units. Like, how interesting are your units? So it kind of comes back to this unit roles thing, where it's like, do you want to focus on generic upgrades, or do you want to focus on each unit having specific abilities? Red Alert 3, for example, every unit has a secondary ability. If you pick the I forgot what the tank's called. We'll just go with the Apocalypse tank. If you pick the Apocalypse tank, for example, its secondary ability has a tractor beam, it pulls the enemy in and it grinds them up and does significant damage. But the only downside is the cannons no longer fire. So do you want the unit to be firing, or do you want the unit just to grab units and pull them out of battle and just grind them up and basically take them out of it? Every unit's got something like that, and that's one way of doing it. StarCraft 2, that each race, like Terran, everything's got a transformation, basically. That's like the main thing for them. Protoss has different abilities, lots of spell casting, and that's kind of the thing. Is like, do you want those different elements in the game, essentially? I think that kind of covers mostly what I wanted to talk about. Like, I'm kind of coming at this from a traditional RTS view. Now, I will say some of it, I do apologise that this is a little bit scatterbrained, because it's definitely all over the place. But to give you guys an idea of what my kind of perfect RTS, if I was building one, it would lean towards some elements of StarCraft and some elements of Command & Conquer. I would probably take like the Harvester style of Command & Conquer, maybe change it up a little bit to make it not super focused like StarCraft 2 is, but maybe there's more element of having you know, more of the harvesters and things like that, but I'm not entirely sure how I would go about it. But if I was making an RTS, that would be kind of like that aspect of it. I'd probably then always go with upgrades over veterinary system, because I think upgrades allow you to kind of have more choice. You can choose when you get them. You can choose the kind of, we want to go for focus on attack, defense, specific upgrades for units, that kind of stuff. I think that's definitely the way forward. And the side tab thing, I prefer that over to clicking into buildings, but that is very personal preference, and I do think that in some aspects can reduce strategy, because what I tend to do is just always shift click and just queue up a ton of units, which is actually quite wasteful doing that. It's wasteful to do it in StarCraft. It's not wasteful to do it in Command & Conquer, because until that unit starts building, it doesn't cost anything. So there is that as well. And then with regards to graphics, having a slightly cartoony or a very stylized art style, I think is the way forward, and having strong unit design, having your things look either, you know, if you're going for a human team, like what type of, you're going for what we have now technology, or you're trying to make it look very human, very bulky. If you're doing an alien type team, how weird you want to look at it, but making things look cool, making things look very different, being able to distinguish between them. And then lastly, yes, unit roles I think is really important. How far you want to go down that scale. Do you want to be the Age of Empires side of it? Do you want to be the Command & Conquer, or somewhere in between? And then finding a game speed. And I think those are the... And obviously, like I said at the beginning, single player focus, that's kind of what I look at when it comes to RTS. But this has kind of been a bit of a weird video, a bit of a ramble, but I just wanted to give you guys my kind of thoughts on these different parts of RTS, and sort of what I would probably go with, what my preferences are. But I think at this point, I would like to see more RTS games come out that are a little bit more traditional, like your StarCraft, like your Command & Conquer, things that kind of focus on that element and not trying to be like, we're going to have like RPG elements, we're going to have 4X elements, because it's not the same. And I think that's the problem, is people keep trying to shoehorn in elements of other games into RTS, and it just doesn't do it for me. Like, you know, I'm trying to think the last good RTS, but I mean, like, it's not considered necessarily a great RTS, but I really like Grey Goo. It's by Petroglyph, ex-Westwood guys, same guys that did Command & Conquer Remastered. And again, that has its problems, but that's, at least it feels like a traditional RTS, I guess, in some degree. There are probably loads out there that I haven't played, but I'm all about your base building your units kind of thing, and less about focusing on, you know, 50 different other things you could be doing, 4X elements and all this other stuff. So there you go, there's my ramblings on RTS. If you like the video, hit like. If you want to see more content like this, then hit the subscribe button. Links for Facebook and Twitter will be down below as always. And until next video, I'll see you then.